The Bench of Disdain. The courtroom reeked of aged documents and quiet desperation. Judge Calvin Thompson, enthroned upon his polished oak dais, tapped a meticulously groomed finger against the gavel. "Mr. Peterson," he intoned, his voice dripping with disdain, "might you illuminate this assembly as to why you saw fit to grace us with your presence, so belatedly, at your own hearing? Did you perhaps mistake this chamber of justice for a casual midday repast?" The young man, scarcely past adolescence, mumbled something about vehicular misfortune and a missed connection. Thompson silenced him with a dismissive gesture. "Prevarications, prevarications. This judicial body adheres to a strict timetable, Mr. Peterson, one you have flagrantly disregarded. An additional $10 levied to your penalty. Proceed." Sarah Miller, perched on a rigid bench for spectators, fought back a grimace. The atmosphere vibrated with the residue of the judge's contempt. She tightened her grip on her notebook, its pages filled with observations of the local legal machinations. Today, she'd come to observe Judge Thompson's courtroom firsthand, a locale spoken of in hushed tones throughout the county. It felt unsettlingly theatrical. Thompson seemed to revel in his authority, each judgment a precisely aimed dart. He'd just finished excoriating a middle-aged woman for failing to properly restrain her diminutive canine, its sharp barks ricocheting through the vaulted space. The woman, mortified, could barely manage an apology. Sarah worried her lip. It wasn't solely the judgments being delivered. It was the palpable disrespect, the reflexive cruelty that Thompson seemed to emanate with every breath. She scribbled intensely, her pen a frantic seismograph registering the tremors of injustice. This wasn't justice. It was an exhibition. The subsequent case involved a land dispute, a morass of legal complexities and conflicting plats. Thompson, his gaze distant, halted the attorney's mid-oration. "Enough, I say. I do not possess infinite hours to squander on this triviality. The property line is hereby designated, wherever Mr. Henderson asserts it to be. Adjourned." The lawyers spluttered in protest, but Thompson quelled them with a single, withering stare. Sarah's jaw clenched. She recognized the need for expediency, but this verged on dereliction. He wasn't even pretending to be engaged. Then, a scraping sound shattered the tense quiet. The courtroom doors groaned open, revealing an elderly woman teetering on the precipice of the room. Small and frail, stooped with age, her face a tapestry of wrinkles. She clutched a time-worn purse to her chest, knuckles bone-white. Sarah watched as the woman cautiously entered, her movements measured and unsure. She seemed wholly overcome by the vastness of the chamber, her eyes flickering about in bewilderment. Judge Thompson released a theatrical sigh, a sound that boomed through the room like distant artillery. "Are you misdirected, madam?" he inquired, his tone thick with impatience. "This is a court of law, not a social gathering." The woman winced, her shoulders slumping lower. Her voice, when it came, was a mere whisper. I think I'm here for a hearing." "Name?" Thompson barked, making no effort to mask his irritation. "Eleanor Vance," the woman murmured. Then, with a touch more clarity, "But everyone calls me Mrs. Lee." Thompson tapped at his computer. Vance, ah yes. Public nuisance violation. Unauthorized sale of, what's this? Unidentified herbal preparations?" He chuckled, a hollow, mirthless sound. "How intriguing." Mrs. Lee edged forward, her steps unsteady. Navigating the expanse proved difficult for her. Sarah observed with growing anxiety. The woman seemed profoundly lost and vulnerable. "Is there someone available to assist this woman?" Thompson inquired, his voice laced with mockery. He didn't pause for a response. "Mrs. Vance, or Lee, or whatever appellation you prefer, kindly proceed to the defendant's station. And do attempt to expedite the process. I am not at liberty to dedicate my entire afternoon." Mrs. Lee moved haltingly, using the benches as a support. She seemed to diminish with each step, her gaze fixed on the floor. A wave of anger surged through Sarah. This was wrong. Utterly, unequivocally wrong. As Mrs. Lee finally reached the defendant's table, she stumbled slightly, her purse falling to the floor with a muffled sound. An array of small, meticulously labeled bottles tumbled out, scattering across the floor. The sharp scent of herbs and spices permeated the air. Thompson threw his hands up in exaggerated dismay. Good grief! Is it beyond this woman's capacity to execute any task competently? Mrs. Lee bent to retrieve the vials, her movements slow and arduous. Her face was ashen, her expression a tableau of confusion and distress. Sarah could endure no more. She shot to her feet, the chair screeching against the polished wood. All eyes swung in her direction. Your Honor, she began, her voice wavering slightly. With the utmost respect, I believe Mrs. Lee would benefit from assistance. A parking ticket and a patronizing judge. Eleanor Vance? The bailiff droned, snapping her out of a reverie. Sunlight fractured through the courtroom's tall windows, painting dusty rectangles on the worn wooden floor. She rose, smoothing the floral skirt she'd chosen for the occasion, a deliberate contrast to the legal eagles in their somber suits. Judge Calvin Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a sneer, peered down from the bench, his gaze lingering on her with undisguised disdain. Mrs. Vance, is it? Or do you prefer Eleanor? He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. This is about a parking ticket, isn't it? You know, those little slips of paper that tell you where not to leave your vehicle? A ripple of suppressed amusement went through the gallery. Eleanor met Thompson's gaze, her expression placid. Mrs. Vance is quite sufficient, Your Honor. All right, Mrs. Vance, Thompson drawled, leaning back in his oversized chair. Let's hear it. You parked in a loading zone on Elm Street. Care to explain why? He tapped the ticket with a manicured fingernail. Perhaps you didn't see the big yellow lines? Or were you simply too busy, knitting? The laughter was louder this time. Harold Finch, seated a few rows back, shifted uncomfortably. He'd seen Thompson in action before, but this was a new level of blatant disrespect. He noticed the subtle tightening of Eleanor's jaw, the almost imperceptible narrowing of her eyes. He knew that look. It was the calm before the storm. Your Honor, Eleanor began, her voice clear and surprisingly strong. I understand the charge. However, the circumstances surrounding the alleged infraction require further explanation. Oh, do tell, Thompson interrupted, rolling his eyes. I'm just dying to hear why parking rules don't apply to you. On the day in question, I was assisting a woman who had collapsed on the sidewalk. Eleanor continued, ignoring his sarcasm. She appeared to be experiencing a medical emergency. I moved my car into the loading zone temporarily to create a safe space and to prevent further obstruction to pedestrian traffic while awaiting the paramedics. A likely story, Thompson scoffed. So, you're a doctor now, are you, Mrs. Vance? Playing Good Samaritan to get out of a parking ticket? I am not a doctor, Your Honor. But I am a responsible citizen. The woman was clearly in distress. I assessed the situation and acted accordingly. The paramedics arrived within minutes, and I moved my vehicle immediately afterward. Did you now? And did you happen to get the name of this woman in distress? Or perhaps a doctor's note confirming your heroic deed? Thompson's voice dripped with condescension. Eleanor paused, her gaze unwavering. I did not, Your Honor. My priority was the woman's well-being, not collecting evidence for a potential parking ticket dispute. As for a doctor's note, perhaps you could subpoena the paramedics who responded to the scene? I'm sure they would be happy to verify my account. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even Thompson seemed momentarily taken aback by her composure. He cleared his throat. That's unnecessary. But I'm still not seeing any valid reason to dismiss this ticket, Mrs. Vance. Ignorance of the law is no excuse, and neither is a flimsy sob story. With all due respect, Your Honor, Eleanor said, her voice rising slightly, I am not ignorant of the law. Nor am I fabricating a sob story. I am simply stating the facts. The fact is, I acted in good faith to assist someone in need. Surely, that deserves some consideration. Thompson leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. Consideration? You think you deserve consideration for breaking the law? This isn't some charity case, Mrs. Vance. This is a court of law. Finch noticed the court officer shift his weight, his eyes darting nervously towards the judge. The murmuring in the gallery had grown louder, more agitated. People were beginning to shuffle in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Thompson's behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, even by his standards. Eleanor stood her ground, her small frame radiating an unexpected force. Then perhaps, Your Honor, this court of law should consider the spirit of the law, rather than blindly adhering to its letter. The law is meant to serve justice, not to punish acts of compassion. Unease in the courtroom. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the hushed courtroom. Mrs. Lee, he drawled, the title dripping with condescension. Are you quite finished rambling? I understand that at your advanced age, memories can be elusive. Perhaps we should call in a nurse to remind you where you are. A ripple of suppressed murmurs went through the gallery. Eleanor Vance, her back ramrod straight despite her apparent frailty, simply inclined her head. Your Honor, I assure you, my faculties are quite intact. I was merely laying the groundwork for a crucial point regarding the defendant's alibi, a point that seems to have escaped the prosecution's notice entirely. Her voice, though soft, carried a steely edge. Sarah Miller's stomach churned. She gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles ached. Thompson's blatant disrespect was sickening. He hadn't let up all morning, interrupting Eleanor, dismissing her arguments with a flick of his wrist, and now, this outright ageism. She wanted to shout, to demand he treat her with respect, but the knot of fear in her throat choked off the impulse. This was his courtroom. His rules. And she was just a reporter, a fledgling one at that, with dreams of a career that could be easily crushed by a powerful judge. She glanced at Mr. Finch, seated a few rows ahead. He was staring straight ahead, his expression unreadable. But as Thompson continued his petty tirade, Finch let out a barely audible sigh, a puff of air that spoke volumes of weary resignation. It was a sound Sarah had come to recognize as his acknowledgement of the world's inherent unfairness. Really, Mrs. Lee, Thompson continued, leaning back in his oversized leather chair, I failed to see the relevance of any of this. The defendant was seen near the crime scene. End of story. Let's not waste the court's time with your creative interpretations. He punctuated the sentence with a dismissive wave of his hand, as if swatting away an annoying fly. Eleanor remained unfazed. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, her voice smooth as silk. The prosecution's case rests solely on circumstantial evidence. Eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable, and proximity to a crime scene hardly constitutes proof of guilt. My creative interpretation, as you so eloquently put it, seeks to introduce factual inconsistencies that the prosecution has conveniently overlooked. Sarah scribbled furiously in her notebook, trying to capture every nuance of the exchange. The air in the courtroom felt thick, heavy with unspoken tension. She imagined the story she'd write. Local judge displays blatant bias in high-profile case. The headline practically screamed from the page. But could she actually publish it? Could she risk the backlash? She envisioned her editor's face, a mixture of excitement and apprehension. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple. She looked again at Mr. Finch. He hadn't moved, but she saw his jaw clench almost imperceptibly. He was a lawyer, a seasoned veteran of the legal system. He must have seen this kind of thing countless times. How could he just sit there? Thompson chuckled, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the courtroom. Factual inconsistencies? My dear Mrs. Lee, you're grasping at straws. I suggest you conserve your energy. This charade has gone on long enough. Eleanor's eyes, usually so warm and gentle, narrowed slightly. A charade, Your Honor? I assure you, this is no charade. I am presenting evidence that challenges the very foundation of the prosecution's case. Evidence that, if considered fairly, will demonstrate my client's innocence. The silence that followed was palpable. Even Thompson seemed momentarily taken aback by her unwavering resolve. Sarah held her breath, willing Eleanor to continue. To fight back against this injustice. Mr. Finch shifted in his seat, a subtle movement that caught Sarah's attention. He wasn't looking at Eleanor. He was looking at Judge Thompson, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was something in his expression, a flicker of something dark and intense, that Sarah hadn't seen before. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something colder, more calculated. Thompson, regaining his composure, slammed his gavel. Enough! I will not tolerate this insubordination. Mrs. Lee, one more outburst and I will hold you in contempt of court. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. The injustice was suffocating. She had to do something. But what? Evidence dismissed. Eleanor, or Mrs. Lee as she was addressed in this charade of a courtroom, adjusted her shawl, the delicate silk a stark contrast to the harsh fluorescent lighting. Judge Thompson, his face a road map of impatience, tapped his gavel against the mahogany stand. Mrs. Lee, are you quite finished dithering? I haven't got all day. She met his gaze, her eyes magnified by her spectacles, holding a surprising steeliness. Not quite, Your Honor. I have evidence to present. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery, quickly silenced by the bailiff's sharp glare. Mrs. Lee carefully extracted a manila envelope from her worn handbag. Inside were photographs, glossy and stark, depicting the overflowing dumpster behind Mr. Abernathy's bakery, the dumpster she was accused of illegally scavenging from. These photographs, Your Honor, clearly show the dumpster overflowing with discarded bread, pastry, and other edible goods. It is, I believe, relevant to the discussion of intent and the alleged violation of Ordinance 34B, Section 7. She handed the photographs to the bailiff, who reluctantly passed them to Judge Thompson. The judge barely glanced at them. He tossed them onto his desk like unwanted playing cards. Irrelevant. Mr. Abernathy has the right to dispose of his property as he sees fit. Your rummaging through it is still illegal. Eleanor remained unperturbed. With all due respect, Your Honor, the ordinance also addresses the issue of waste disposal and its potential impact on public health. These photographs demonstrate a clear disregard for proper waste management protocols. She pulled out a second envelope, this one thicker. Furthermore, I have here sworn affidavits from 3 neighborhood residents who have witnessed Mr. Abernathy's consistent practice of overstocking and subsequent discarding of perfectly good food. Again, the bailiff took the envelope, and again, Judge Thompson dismissed its contents without a proper examination. Hearsay. Conjecture. This court does not operate on the basis of neighborhood gossip. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Mrs. Lee, I'm beginning to suspect you are deliberately wasting the court's time. Are you attempting to be held in contempt? Certainly not, Your Honor, Eleanor said calmly, though a flicker of something unreadable danced in her eyes. I am merely attempting to present a complete picture. These affidavits also address the chronic rodent problem in the alleyway behind the bakery, a direct result of the unsanitary disposal practices. My actions, far from being criminal, were an attempt to mitigate a public nuisance. Your actions were illegal. Judge Thompson thundered, his face flushed. The ordinance is clear. You are guilty of violating it. I find you guilty as charged. He slammed his gavel down, the sound echoing in the tense silence. A fine of $500, payable within 30 days. And Mrs. Lee, consider this your final warning. Any further disruptions, any further attempts to mitigate public nuisances in this manner, and you will find yourself facing more than just a fine. This court will not tolerate your eccentricities. Eleanor didn't flinch. She simply stood, her frail frame surprisingly erect. Your Honor, I believe you are acting prematurely. I have not yet had the opportunity to present the key piece of evidence in my defense. Judge Thompson's eyes narrowed. Are you defying my ruling, madam? Do you wish to add contempt of court to your list of infractions? Not at all, Your Honor. I merely wish to ensure that justice is served, as I believe we all do. This evidence directly addresses the question of ownership, the very basis of Mr. Abernathy's claim to those discarded goods. She reached into her handbag again, this time producing a single, folded piece of paper. It was old, the edges yellowed and brittle. As she unfolded it, a faint, musty scent filled the air. Before she could present it, Judge Thompson cut her off, his voice dripping with disdain. Enough! I have heard all I need to hear. The evidence is dismissed. The fine stands. Court is adjourned. He banged the gavel with such force that it nearly jumped off the stand. As the gallery began to stir, a low, almost inaudible murmur spread through the room. Eleanor stood her ground, the unfolded document still in her hand, her expression unreadable. Judge Thompson turned and swept out of the courtroom, his robes billowing behind him, leaving Eleanor alone with the buzzing fluorescent lights and the lingering scent of old paper, a silent testament to the injustice that had just transpired. The key piece of evidence remained unexamined, a secret weapon she would have to wield another day. A young lawyer's stand. The courtroom air was thick with anticipation, a palpable weight akin to the charged atmosphere preceding a summer thunderstorm. Sarah Miller worried her lip, the faint coppery taste of blood a constant companion lately. High above, Judge Thompson, a hawk surveying its prey, was berating Eleanor Vance, his words laced with thinly disguised disdain. Mrs. Lee, he drawled, the title itself a weapon. Are you genuinely suggesting that someone of your background possesses the capacity to grasp the intricate complexities of this case? Seated at the defense table, Eleanor remained composed, hands clasped serenely. A subtle tension flickered around her eyes, the sole outward sign of her distress. Sarah's gut twisted. It wasn't just the condescension, it was the flagrant disregard for due process. Thompson had repeatedly silenced Eleanor's attempts to submit vital evidence, dismissed objections with a flick of his wrist, and allowed Billings, the plaintiff's corpulent lawyer, to dominate the proceedings with theatrical excess. Sarah diligently recorded each moment, a growing disquiet fueling her notes. Her editor would feast on this story, a powerful judge seemingly preying on a vulnerable Asian woman. A headline goldmine. Yet the potential fallout from publishing such an exposé, particularly one accusing a sitting judge of partiality, chilled her. Thompson wielded considerable influence, with allies in powerful circles. Sarah was merely a local reporter, struggling to make ends meet. Billings, now addressing the jury, bellowed, his index finger stabbing the air. This woman, Mrs. Lee, pleads self-defense. But I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, does this savage assault scream self-defense? He swept his arm towards a photograph depicting a bruised and battered Mr. Henderson, the accuser. This is the aftermath of a brutal, unprovoked attack. Sarah glanced at Eleanor. Amid the chaotic swirl, she remained a picture of quiet strength, almost beatific. There was a reserved grace about her that Sarah found both disquieting and deeply inspiring. Thompson cleared his throat, the sound echoing sharply in the silenced room. Mrs. Lee, do you have any final statement to offer in response to Mr. Billings' assertions? Eleanor rose with measured movements. Yes, Your Honor. Her voice, though soft, carried clearly as she began to outline the events leading to the confrontation, highlighting the months of threats and intimidation she had endured. But Thompson abruptly cut her off. Enough, Mrs. Lee. The jury has heard sufficient testimony. I will not permit you to further cloud the issue with your inventions. He slammed his gavel, the reverberation punctuating his words. A surge of anger coursed through Sarah, immediate and intense. It wasn't solely the injustice leveled at Eleanor. It was the subtle undermining of the very principles of law and equity she held sacred. This wasn't justice. It was a travesty. She gripped her pen so fiercely her fingers ached. She pictured her father, a former police officer who had instilled in her a profound respect for the legal system, for upholding what was right, regardless of the cost. He'd always emphasized, "The truth matters, Sarah. Always." Her heart pounded a frantic rhythm. Fear constricted her throat, yet a more compelling force, a sense of moral imperative, propelled her to her feet. Your Honor, Sarah declared, her voice trembling slightly, yet resolute. Every head in the room pivoted toward her, a sea of surprised and confused faces. Thompson's eyes narrowed to slits, his face darkening with fury. Who are you? Explain this interruption. Sarah swallowed against the dryness in her mouth. Your Honor, I am Sarah Miller, a reporter with the Willow Creek Gazette. And with the utmost respect, Your Honor, I must take exception to the conduct of this trial." A collective intake of breath swept the courtroom. Billings sputtered, his complexion turning an alarming shade of magenta. Eleanor simply observed, her face an enigma. Thompson's rage was now barely leashed. "You are out of order, Ms. Miller! Resume your seat immediately, or I will cite you for contempt." Sarah stood firm, her voice growing stronger. "Your Honor, I contend there have been multiple breaches of proper procedure in this case. Crucial evidence has been suppressed, the defendant has been consistently silenced, and there is a discernible prejudice against Mrs. Lee. I believe it is my responsibility, both as a member of the press and as a citizen, to raise these concerns." Lifting her chin, she met Thompson's incandescent glare. "Specifically, Your Honor, I direct the court's attention to Section 32, Paragraph 7 of the state's criminal procedure." The courtroom fell silent, save for the steady tick of the wall clock. All eyes focused on Sarah, the young reporter audacious enough to challenge the authority of Judge Calvin Thompson. The storm had broken. Threats and transformation. "Are you contesting my authority, Miss Miller?" Judge Thompson's complexion deepened to the hue of aged port wine. The booming timbre of his voice sharpened to a dangerous edge. He jutted forward, his immense frame a physical intimidation over the bench. "You're a reporter, not a legal scholar. Confine yourself to documenting the proceedings." Sarah felt a flush creep up her neck. "I am merely observing, Your Honor, that the line of inquiry seems tangential, and frankly, insulting." The words felt weightless even as they escaped her. The rhythmic tap of the stenographer's keys underscored her audacity. Thompson's gavel crashed, the sound reverberating through the hushed courtroom. "Insolent? You dare accuse me of insolence? I've dedicated my life to upholding the law, young lady, and I won't tolerate a mere journalist disrupting my court." He stabbed the air with a thick finger in her direction. He was unraveling, Sarah realized, and a reckless spark ignited within her. Yet, a tremor of fear ran through her. He wielded the power to tarnish her reputation, to exile her from the very field she was struggling to establish herself in. "I'm not making accusations, Your Honor," she retorted, forcing a calmness she was far from feeling. "I am simply articulating my observations." Thompson's eyes narrowed to pinpricks. "Observe this, Miss Miller, one more disruption, one more unsolicited opinion, and I'll have you ejected from this courtroom. And that won't be the end of it. I have influence, Miss Miller. Influence that could render your life exceedingly unpleasant. Is that understood?" The threat lingered, a palpable weight in the air. Sarah swallowed, the knot in her throat tight. She understood with grim clarity. He was leveraging his power, his office, to stifle her. To safeguard himself. She risked a glance at Mrs. Lee, half expecting to see fear etched on the woman's face. Instead, Mrs. Lee sat with an unsettling stillness, head bowed slightly, hands clasped in her lap. She possessed the delicate stillness of a china doll, seemingly vulnerable. A wave of guilt washed over Sarah. Her impetuous actions were only exacerbating the situation for the woman on the stand. Judge Thompson, having issued his thinly veiled threat, refocused his attention. "Now, Mrs. Vance," he purred, his voice dripping with insincere cordiality. "Let's proceed, shall we? Where were we? Ah, yes. Your appreciation of the nuances of zoning law." He smirked, savoring his imagined triumph. But the atmosphere was shifting. A subtle energy filled the room. A momentous change was about to occur. Mrs. Lee slowly straightened. The hunched posture she had previously exhibited seemed to vanish. Her shoulders lifted, squaring with newfound resolution. She raised her chin, her gaze locking with Judge Thompson's with unwavering intensity. Then, with a measured movement, she reached up and removed her heavy-framed spectacles. The effect was transformative. Without them, her eyes, no longer magnified and watery, appeared sharp, intelligent, and laser-focused. Decades of knowledge and experience seemed to burn within them. A collective intake of breath swept through the courtroom. Mrs. Lee placed the glasses meticulously on the table. She inhaled deeply, and when she spoke, the voice that emerged bore no resemblance to the hesitant, accented murmur of moments before. It was clear, powerful, and resolute. A voice that commanded respect. "Perhaps, Your Honor," she stated, her words precise and clipped, delivered in flawless, unaccented English. "We should abandon this pretense. I find your attempts at intimidation tiresome." Judge Thompson's jaw slackened. He sputtered, searching for words that seemed to have deserted him. Who are you?" he stammered, his face now a patchwork of crimson and purple. A mere flicker of a smile graced Mrs. Lee's lips. "My name, as you are aware, is Eleanor Vance. However, in professional circles, I am known as Eleanor Vance, Esquire. And I assure you, Judge Thompson, I possess an intimate familiarity with the intricacies of zoning regulations, constitutional law, and I might add, judicial ethics. Perhaps to a greater degree than yourself." The revelation of Eleanor Vance. The sharp rap of Judge Thompson's gavel shattered the stifling atmosphere. "Mrs. Lee," he drawled, his tone dripping with a condescension thick enough to choke on. "Were you about to, perhaps, attempt a summation? Please proceed before ennui claims us all." Eleanor Vance, alias Mrs. Lee, slowly pushed herself to her feet, age having knotted her knuckles as she gripped the table's edge for support. Beside her, Sarah Miller fought back tears, her posture tense as a coiled spring. Her ill-timed outburst, a volatile mix of guilt and fury regarding the discriminatory trust, had clearly been a catastrophic misstep. Thompson looked ready to devour the case whole, dismissing it with undisguised glee. "Your Honor," Mrs. Lee began, her voice a fragile thread barely audible above the courtroom's hushed breathing. "Before advancing my argument, a point of clarification demands attention." Thompson reclined, a smirk etching itself onto his face. "Indeed? And what earth-shattering revelation might you be about to unleash, Mrs. Lee?" The elderly woman straightened. An almost imperceptible shift, yet even the usually imperturbable Mr. Finch registered it. The quaver vanished from her voice, replaced by a resonant steel that riveted the room. "My name," she declared, her gaze locked onto Judge Thompson, "is not Mrs. Lee. It is Eleanor Vance." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Sarah's head jerked up, eyes wide saucers of incredulity. Mr. Finch leaned forward, his customary sardonic mask momentarily displaced by genuine astonishment. Thompson's smirk wavered, like a reflection disturbed by a sudden ripple. "Vance? Eleanor Vance? Preposterous. Eleanor Vance is a legend. She wouldn't deign to involve herself in this trivial squabble over inheritance." Eleanor Vance dipped her head, a fleeting, almost wistful smile playing on her lips. "Yet here I stand, Your Honor. After years spent honing my skills, championing justice within courtrooms nationwide, I sought the solace of a quieter existence. Anonymity, if you will. Alas, injustice, Your Honor, possesses an uncanny knack for luring one back into the fray." She paused, allowing her words to steep in the sudden silence. Then, pivoting to address the jury, she swept her gaze across their faces. "I have observed these proceedings with interest, absorbing the arguments presented, and noting the, shall we say, idiosyncratic interpretations of legal doctrine espoused by the defense." Turning back to Thompson, her eyes now blazed with an incisive brilliance that belied her years. "Your Honor's assertion that this trust constitutes a simple matter of familial discretion is, with the deepest respect, a gross distortion of established legal principles. The Miller Trust, in its present form, is a blatant violation of the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. To deny Sarah Miller her rightful inheritance solely on the basis of her race is not merely unethical, it is patently illegal." Thompson sputtered, his face blossoming into a crimson rage. "Counselor, this is outrageous. You cannot simply invent a new persona and launch into this tirade." Eleanor Vance raised a hand, silencing him with unexpected command. "Rest assured, Your Honor, my credentials are beyond reproach. The requisite documentation, including affidavits and sworn statements verifying my identity and legal standing, has been duly filed with the court." She indicated a meticulously stacked pile of documents on the table beside her. Then, with the precision of a surgeon, she dissected Thompson's arguments. Case after case spilled forth, her voice ringing with conviction as she demolished his claims piece by piece. She exposed the subtle biases that informed his rulings, the almost imperceptible ways he'd steered the proceedings toward the defendant's favor. The defense's contention, she continued, her voice gaining momentum, that the discriminatory clause represents merely the personal predilections of the testator is a dangerous relic of a bygone era. The law exists to safeguard the vulnerable, to ensure equitable treatment for all citizens, irrespective of race or origin. To uphold such a clause is to endorse discrimination and perpetuate injustice. Sarah stared, jaw slack. This was not the retiring, unassuming woman she had befriended. This was a legal juggernaut, tearing down the bastions of prejudice with the force of intellect and unwavering conviction. Even Mr. Finch appeared impressed, offering a nearly imperceptible nod, a grudging acknowledgement of her formidable skill. Thompson, visibly discomposed, slammed his gavel. I will not countenance this farce. I demand you cease this charade and permit the court to resume its proper function. Eleanor Vance cut him off, her voice a calm yet unyielding force. Your Honor, I am Eleanor Vance. And I intend to see justice prevail in this courtroom, even if it proves to be my final act. Checkmate. So, Mrs. Lee. Judge Thompson sneered, the condescension practically dripping from his voice. You claim my ruling was unjust? On what grounds, pray tell, besides your obvious disagreement with the law? Eleanor adjusted her spectacles, the glint of the courtroom lights reflecting off the lenses. On the grounds of prejudice, Your Honor. A prejudice so deeply ingrained, it blinded you to the facts. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Sarah Miller's eyes widened. She leaned forward, hope blooming in her chest. Mr. Finch, seated a few rows behind, merely raised a skeptical eyebrow, though a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Prejudice? Thompson sputtered, his face reddening. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Lee. Do you have any evidence to support this slander? Eleanor's voice remained calm, a stark contrast to the judge's rising anger. I do, Your Honor. During the initial hearing, you repeatedly referred to my client, Mrs. Chen, as that woman and dismissed her testimony as incoherent ramblings without allowing her translator to fully convey her statements. You also made several comments about the influx of immigrants into this community and the problems they bring. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Those were merely observations, he blustered. Relevant to the case. Relevant to a case about a property dispute? Eleanor challenged, her tone sharp. Or relevant to your personal biases, Your Honor? Biases that, I might add, are well documented in your previous rulings. Several cases involving minority plaintiffs have been overturned on appeal due to your questionable interpretations of the law. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint hum of the ventilation system. Thompson's face was now a shade of purple that rivaled the velvet on his judge's chair. Furthermore, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength, I have here transcripts from a speech you gave at a local Republican fundraiser last year. In that speech, you specifically targeted Asian immigrants, accusing them of undermining American values and taking jobs from hardworking citizens. Are those also merely observations, Your Honor? The courtroom erupted in a low murmur. Sarah gasped, clapping a hand over her mouth. Even Mr. Finch's usual stoic expression flickered with surprise. Thompson banged his gavel, but the sound was swallowed by the rising tide of voices. Silence! He roared, his voice cracking. I will have order in this court. Eleanor remained unfazed. The evidence speaks for itself, Your Honor. You allowed your personal prejudices to cloud your judgment. You denied Mrs. Chen a fair hearing, and you unjustly ruled against her. This wasn't about the law. It was about your preconceived notions about who she is. She reached into her worn leather bag and pulled out a neatly bound document. I have here a formal request for your recusal, Your Honor, along with a motion to overturn your previous ruling. I believe the evidence presented clearly demonstrates a conflict of interest. Thompson stared at the document as if it were a venomous snake. His hands trembled as he reached for it. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Eleanor watched him, her expression unreadable. The air in the courtroom crackled with tension. The murmurs grew louder, morphing into hushed whispers of recusal and overturn. Finally, Thompson slammed the gavel down with a force that echoed through the room. "This court is adjourned!" he bellowed, his voice hoarse. He rose abruptly from his chair and stormed out of the courtroom, leaving behind a stunned and buzzing audience. As the gallery began to empty, Sarah rushed towards Eleanor, her eyes shining with admiration. "Mrs. Lee," she exclaimed, "you were incredible! You really showed him!" Eleanor smiled faintly. "The truth has a way of doing that, Sarah." Mr. Finch approached them, his expression unreadable. "Well, Mrs. Lee," he said, his voice dry, "you certainly know how to make an entrance. And an exit." He paused. "Checkmate, I believe, is the correct term." Eleanor inclined her head slightly. "Indeed, Mr. Finch. Indeed." She gathered her belongings, a quiet satisfaction radiating from her. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but today, at least, justice had taken a small, but significant, step forward. Justice served. Judge Thompson's countenance was a battleground of conflicted feeling. Dismay wrestled with reluctant acquiescence, deepening the parentheses bracketing his mouth with each strained moment. The courtroom air hung heavy, a suffocating blanket of silence pierced only by the thin whine of the overhead lights. He rasped, clearing his throat, the sound booming in the stillness. "Given these unforeseen developments, and to safeguard the probity of these proceedings, I will recuse myself," he declared, his voice a strangled rasp. Each word seemed wrenched from him, a painful confession. He skirted Eleanor's gaze, fixing his attention on some distant point above the public gallery. A wave of whispers surged through the room. Beside Eleanor, Sarah gripped her hand, eyes reflecting a blend of astonishment and triumph. Eleanor, however, radiated composure. Her face, a study in serenity, carried the quiet grace of one who had weathered far fiercer gales. A ghost of a smile played on her lips, hinting at deep satisfaction, not overt triumph. She rose with slow deliberateness, leaning lightly on her cane for support. "Your Honor," she stated, her voice, aged yet full of strength, resonating through the room. "In light of your decision, I retract my objection. My purpose was never to impede justice, only to ensure its impartial delivery. With your removal, I believe that aim has been achieved." The effect was immediate. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, supplanted by a current of near-audible relief. Even Thompson, his face still masked by simmering resentment, seemed to deflate, the fight visibly ebbing from him. He offered a brusque nod. "Very well. This court stands adjourned until a suitable replacement is found." He slammed the gavel down with excessive force, the echo ricocheting through the hall, before departing the bench without another glance, his robes billowing around him like thunderclouds. A low hum filled the room. A flurry of motion began as people stirred, murmuring to one another, eyes flitting back and forth between Eleanor and the now vacant judge's chair. Sarah, beaming, turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Lee," she breathed, her voice laced with wonder. "You did it! You actually did it!" Eleanor offered a smile, warm and genuine, etching fine lines at the corners of her eyes. "It was the necessary action, Sarah. Sometimes, justice demands a gentle nudge." As they navigated their way out of the courtroom, a throng began to coalesce around them. Reporters, notebooks at the ready, thrust microphones toward Eleanor, showering her with questions. She simply offered a polite refusal, and a small, knowing smile. "No comment, ladies and gentlemen. The evidence speaks for itself." Outside, the afternoon sun warmed her face. The air, crisp with autumn's approach, carried scents of decaying leaves and the low thrum of city life. Sarah, still reeling with excitement, helped Eleanor into the waiting car. "I can't fathom it," Sarah said, shaking her head in disbelief. He actually recused himself. Judge Thompson! Everyone said he was untouchable. Eleanor patted her hand. No one is immune, Sarah. Particularly not when they misuse their authority. Sarah studied Eleanor with undisguised admiration. You're remarkable, Mrs. Lee. You stood your ground, even when he was so unfair. I don't believe I would have possessed the fortitude. Eleanor's expression softened. Fortitude isn't the absence of fear, Sarah, it's proceeding despite it. And occasionally, the most valiant act is to voice truth to power. The car eased away from the courthouse, leaving behind a scene of pandemonium and speculation. Judge Thompson, standing, once secure, now lay shattered. The story of the elderly woman who dared defy a powerful judge would spread rapidly, captivating the nation. Eleanor reclined against the seat, closing her eyes. Her task was far from complete. This was merely the first step. The crusade for justice was far from over, and she intended to see it to its conclusion, come what may. She conjured the faces of those who had suffered injustice, those silenced, those who had abandoned hope. They depended on her, and she wouldn't fail them. The weight of responsibility settled upon her, a burden she shouldered willingly, an honor to carry. Her delicate frame disguised the iron in her will, the unwavering resolve that burned within. The world had once underestimated Eleanor Vance. It would not repeat that error.